The late autumn wind carried the scent of snow as it swept across the Nebraska plains. Sarah Winters pulled her tattered wool coat tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the churning waters of the Platte River before her. The wagon train. Master's words still echoed in her ears. We cross at dawn. No delays. 23 wagons, 68 settlers, all bound for Oregon Territory, all of them believing the river crossing would be the last major obstacle before winter forced them to make camp. None of them suspected it would be their last obstacle ever. Sarah watched as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold, illuminating the faces of anxious travelers preparing for the crossing. Her husband Thomas checked their wagon's wheels one last time, while their 10-year-old son Daniel gathered the last of their belongings from their makeshift camp. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It doesn't look right, Sarah whispered, studying the river's swollen banks. Recent rains had raised the water levels, and the current moved with unusual force. Thomas, perhaps we should wait. Her husband's weather-beaten face softened as he took her hand. The trainmaster says we can't afford to delay. Winter's coming fast, and we need to make at least another 100 miles before the first heavy snow. But Sarah's protest died on her lips as the wagon master's voice rang out across the camp. First wagons in! Let's move, people! The lead wagon lurched forward, oxen straining against their yokes as they were driven toward the water's edge. Sarah climbed onto their own wagon seat, helping Daniel up beside her while Thomas took the reins. Their position as the 11th wagon in line meant they watched as the first several teams entered the water. The crossing began smoothly enough. The lead wagon made steady progress, reaching nearly halfway across before anything seemed amiss. Then came the sound, a low, distant roar that grew louder with each passing second. "What is that?" Daniel asked, clutching his mother's arm. Thomas stood up on the wagon seat, shading his eyes against the rising sun. His face suddenly went pale. "Flash flood!" he shouted, his voice joining a chorus of similar warnings erupting throughout the camped upstream. A wall of water rushed toward them, carrying debris and entire trees in its violent path. The rain that had fallen in the mountains for days had finally gathered into a killing force. "Turn back!" the wagon master screamed, but it was too late for those already in the river. Sarah watched in horror as the flood hit the lead wagon, flipping it instantly. Oxen, supplies, and people disappeared beneath the roiling waters. The second wagon capsized moments later, then the third. "Thomas!" Sarah screamed as their own wagon began moving forward, caught in the panicked rush of teams trying to back away from the river's edge. "Hold on!" Thomas jumped down, fighting to control their frightened oxen. The chaos that followed burned itself into Sarah's memory in disjointed flashes. Wagons overturning, children screaming, livestock drowning. Thomas managed to unhitch their team just as another wagon crashed into theirs, sending it sliding toward the riverbank. "Daniel!" Sarah clutched her son as their wagon tilted. "Jump!" She pushed the boy toward Thomas's outstretched arms before leaping from the wagon herself. Her feet had barely touched the ground when the surging waters caught the wagon, pulling it into the current. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees as she watched their home, their supplies, everything they owned, disappear into the flood. Thomas pulled her to her feet. "We have to get to higher ground, now!" Hand in hand, the three of them ran, joining. Others fleeing the rising waters, but the riverbank had become treacherous, mud giving way under desperate feet. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her, heard Daniel's terrified cry as a section of bank collapsed. "Mother!" She reached for him as both Daniel and Thomas slid toward the water. Her fingers brushed her son's coat before he was swept beyond her. "Reach!" Thomas diving in after him. "No!" Sarah screamed, scrambling along the bank, following their forms as the current carried them downstream. Around her, Similar tragedies unfolded as the flood claimed victim after victim. She ran until her lungs burned, keeping pace with the rushing water, watching in desperation as Thomas managed to reach Daniel, pulling the boy's head above water. For one brief moment, husband and wife locked eyes across the distance. Thomas raised his arm, pointing westward before the current pulled them around a bend and out of sight. Sarah collapsed on the bank, her scream of anguish lost in the roar of the flood and the cries of others who had lost everything. In less than an hour, the carefully organized wagon train had been reduced to scattered survivors and floating debris. By midday, the waters had receded enough to reveal the full extent of the devastation. Bodies lay strewn along the riverbanks. Broken wagons and drowned livestock dotted the river for miles. Of the 23 wagons that had begun the day, only 3 remained intact, pulled back from the water in time. Of the 68 souls, fewer than 20 had survived. Sarah spent the day searching the riverbanks, calling for Thomas and Daniel until her voice gave out. She found only strangers, some alive, many dead. When night fell, she joined the other survivors around a hastily built fire, hollow-eyed and numb. "We can't stay here," announced Jeremiah Collins, a grizzled farmer who had lost his wife in the flood. "We have supplies for maybe 3 days. The nearest settlement is Fort Kearney, about 100 miles east." "What about those who might still be alive downstream?" Sarah asked, her voice raw. Collins shook his head. "Anyone not found by now is gone, Ma'am. I'm sorry." "My husband pointed west before the current took him," Sarah insisted. "I saw him. He and my son might have made it to shore downriver." "Mrs. Winters," said Collins gently, "even if they survived the flood, they have no supplies, no weapons. Winter's coming. We have to think about the living now." The group decided to head east at first light, back the way they had come. As the others sought what rest they could, Sarah stared into the darkness westward, remembering Thomas's final gesture. Dawn brought no change in the survivors' plans. They would return to Fort Kearney, then decide whether to continue east to settled lands or wait until spring to attempt the journey west again. "Are you coming, Mrs. Winters?" asked Collins, as the small group prepared to depart. Sarah stood apart, her few salvaged possessions bundled in a shawl, her gaze fixed on the western horizon. "No," she said quietly. "My family is that way." "You'll die alone out there," Collins warned. "Better to die searching than to live wandering," she replied. As the survivors disappeared eastward, Sarah turned west, following the river's course. She had no illusions about the odds. A woman alone on the plains faced dangers beyond counting. Exposure, starvation, wild animals, hostile tribes. But somewhere ahead, she believed Thomas and Daniel waited for her. She would find them or join them in death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah walked until sunset that first day, scanning the riverbanks for any sign of survivors. She found scattered possessions, a child's doll, a broken wheel, a soaked family Bible, but no people, living or dead. When darkness fell, she made a meager camp beneath an overhanging rock, shivering through the night without a fire, afraid to attract unwanted attention. Dawn of the second day brought a thin layer of frost that crunched beneath her boots as she continued her journey. Her provisions consisted of a small pouch of jerky and hardtack salvaged from the wreckage, barely enough for 3 days if carefully rationed. She chewed a small piece of jerky as she walked, trying to quiet her growling stomach. By midday, the terrain had changed. The river carved its way through more rugged country, with bluffs and ravines replacing the flat plains. It made her search more difficult, forcing her to choose between following the water's immediate edge or taking higher paths that offered better visibility. As the sun began its descent, Sarah paused to rest, her body aching from the unaccustomed exertion That's when she saw it, a scrap of familiar blue fabric caught on a branch near the water's edge. Daniel's coat. Her exhaustion forgotten, Sarah scrambled down the embankment. The fabric was unmistakable. She had patched that very coat just weeks before. Heart pounding, she searched the surrounding area, calling their names again with renewed hope. "Thomas! Daniel!" Only the wind answered, but the presence of the coat fragment told her what she needed to know. She was on the right path. They had come this way. As she prepared to continue, Sarah felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, scanning the bluffs above her. Nothing moved, yet the feeling persisted. After years on the frontier, she had learned to trust such instincts. She gathered her bundle and continued westward with new purpose, unaware that keen eyes indeed tracked her movement from the shadows of a distant ridge, eyes that had already been following her path since morning, eyes that belonged to a Pawnee hunter who had spotted her lone figure against the vast prairie and had made the decision to follow. Night was falling, and Sarah knew she needed to find shelter before complete darkness, and dropping temperatures made her situation even more perilous. The question wasn't just whether Thomas and Daniel had survived the flood, but whether she would survive long enough to find them. Blood mixed with river mud on Sarah's palms as she clawed her way up the steep embankment. The scrap of Daniel's coat clutched in her raw fingers was both talisman and torment. Proof of life, yet no guarantee. The setting sun painted the western sky crimson, as if the heavens themselves bled for all she had lost. She reached the crest, lungs burning, and collapsed behind the shelter of a wind-twisted juniper. From this vantage, the river stretched like a silver serpent through the gathering darkness, its innocent gleam betraying nothing of the lives it had swallowed yesterday. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. Sarah's gaze darted to the horizon where storm clouds gathered, black against the dying light. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the first stinging pellets of sleet struck her face. Without proper shelter, a prairie storm could kill as surely as any flood. She forced herself to her feet, scanning the landscape for refuge. In the twilight, she spotted a dark recess in the bluff about a quarter-mile ahead. A cave, perhaps, or at least an overhang. Her legs trembled with exhaustion as she stumbled toward it. The sleet intensified, driven by gusting winds that cut through her sodden clothing. By the time she reached the recess, a shallow cave barely deep enough to qualify as such, her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Inside, the space was just large enough for her to curl up away from the driving sleet. Sarah huddled against the rear wall, wrapping her arms around herself. She pulled Daniel's fragment of coat from her pocket, pressing it to her face. Despite the cold, despite everything, it still carried the faintest scent of him. "I'm coming," she whispered into the blue fabric. "Hold on, both of you, hold on." Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She allowed herself the smallest piece of jerky from her dwindling supplies, knowing she needed to ration carefully. As she chewed, something caught her eye. Marks scratched into the cave wall. Not random, but deliberate. Even in the dim light, Sarah recognized them, trail signs. She'd seen Thomas study similar markings during their journey. These were Pawnee symbols, showing water sources, hunting grounds, and something else, warnings of danger to the north. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through her. She was not in friendly territory. Sleep came in restless bursts, broken by the storm's fury and dreams of reaching hands disappearing beneath churning waters. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by a thin layer of ice that glittered in the pale sunlight. Sarah emerged stiffly from her shelter, every muscle protesting the night spent on cold stone. She took inventory of her situation with the grim practicality of a frontier woman. 3 small pieces of jerky remained. The hardtack was gone. Her water skin was half full. Her boots, never meant for such a journey, were already showing signs of wear, and she was being watched. The certainty of it prickled at the base of her neck. Sarah kept her movements casual as she scanned the ridgeline above. Nothing moved, yet the feeling persisted. Not the cold observation of a predator eyeing its next meal, but something more calculating. She began walking, following the river westward. The ice coating the ground crunched beneath her feet, then melted as the sun climbed higher. By midday, the terrain had changed again, rockier, with sparse patches of pine and juniper clinging to the slopes. The river narrowed here, running faster between rocky banks. Near a bend in the river, Sarah stopped short. A campsite, recently abandoned. The ashes in the small fire pit still held warmth when she placed her hand near them. Someone had been here, perhaps just hours ago. Hope surged through her as she searched the area. The camp was neat, organized in a way that reminded her of Thomas's methodical nature. But something felt wrong. The arrangement was too careful, too deliberate, not the hasty camp of flood survivors. A twig snapped behind her. Sarah whirled, reaching instinctively for a weapon she didn't possess. 20 yards away, at the edge of the trees, stood a man. Not Thomas. Not a white settler at all. The Pawnee hunter regarded her with unreadable eyes, his face impassive beneath the twin black streaks painted across his cheekbones. He carried a bow, though it wasn't drawn. A knife hung at his waist. He made no move toward her, yet neither did he retreat. For a long moment they stared at each other across the clearing, woman and warrior, both alone in a harsh land for reasons the other couldn't comprehend. Sarah's mind raced through limited options. Run. He would catch her easily. Call out. Who would hear? Attack. The thought was absurd. Her only weapon was the small knife she used for cutting jerky. Instead, she did the unexpected. She straightened, meeting his gaze directly, and spoke. I am looking for my husband and son. The river took them. She gestured toward the water, then mimicked swimming, followed by her hands separating, universal signs she hoped would cross the language barrier. The hunter's expression remained unchanged, giving no indication whether he understood. He took a single step forward, then stopped when Sarah tensed. From a pouch at his waist, he withdrew something and held it out. Even at this distance, Sarah recognized it. A wooden horse, crudely carved. Daniel's toy. Her heart stuttered. My sons, she gasped. Where did you find this? Where are they? The Pawnee pointed downstream, then made a sweeping gesture toward the western horizon. Without another word, he melted back into the trees, leaving Sarah alone with the implications of what she'd seen. The toy was proof. Daniel had come this way. But had the Pawnee found it beside a body, or had her son lost it while still alive? And why show it to her at all? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah clutched the wooden horse, her thumb tracing the familiar notch where Daniel had dropped it in the campfire once, back in Missouri. This was no false hope, no mistaken identity. This was her son's cherished possession. She studied the direction the Pawnee had indicated, westward, always westward. The same direction Thomas had pointed before the current swept him away. With renewed determination, Sarah continued her journey, the wooden horse secured safely in her pocket alongside the fragment of coat. The Pawnee's appearance troubled her, but he'd had every opportunity to harm her, and hadn't. Instead, he'd given her the first real evidence that she wasn't chasing ghosts. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself checking over her shoulder, half expecting to see the hunter following her. Yet the plains behind her remained empty, at least to her untrained eye. By late afternoon, she reached a section of river where the current had carved away the bank, creating a steep drop to the water below. The path ahead required either a treacherous descent to walk along the narrow shoreline or a wide detour away from the water. Sarah chose to stay near the river, unwilling to risk missing any sign of her family. The climb down was slow, her fingers gripping exposed roots and rocks. Halfway down, a root gave way under her weight. She slid several feet, rocks tearing at her skirt and scraping her legs before she managed to halt her descent. Clinging to the embankment, catching her breath, Sarah happened to look directly across the river and froze. There, embedded in the mud of the opposite bank, was a wagon wheel. Not just any wheel, but one with a distinctive patch on its rim where Thomas had repaired it after a mishap in Kansas Territory. Their wagon. The sight of it sent her scrambling down the remaining distance, heedless of the cuts and bruises. At the river's edge, she stared across the 40 feet of fast-moving water that separated her from this tangible piece of her former life. The river was too deep, the current too strong to cross safely. Yet on that far bank might be more than just a wheel. There might be supplies, clues, perhaps even, she couldn't complete the thought. Sarah paced along her side of the river, searching for a crossing point. A quarter-mile downstream, she found it, a series of large rocks creating a natural, if precarious, pathway across. The crossing was treacherous. Twice she nearly lost her footing on the slick stones, the icy water rushing just inches below her. Boots. When she finally reached the opposite bank, she was shaking from exertion and cold, but triumph surged through her. The wheel was still there, and beyond it, half buried in the mud, lay more debris from their wagon, a broken axle, shattered boards, a metal cooking pot bent nearly in half by the force of the water. Sarah worked feverishly, digging through the mud with her bare hands, searching for anything useful, anything that might tell her more about Thomas and Daniel's fate. Under a tangle of broken wood, she found their medicine box, miraculously intact, though sodden. Inside, the glass bottles had survived, including Thomas's precious bottle of laudanum and her own herbal remedies. She transferred these to her bundle, knowing their value. As the sun sank lower, she widened her search, moving up and down the bank. That's when she saw them, footprints. Small footprints, partially washed away by subsequent rain, but still visible in a patch of mud, protected by an overhang. The size was right for Daniel, and they led away from the river toward a stand of cottonwoods in the distance. "Daniel!" she called, voice cracking with desperate hope. "Thomas!" Only the wind answered, rustling through the prairie grass. Sarah followed the tracks until they disappeared on harder ground. Night was falling rapidly now, and with it, the temperature. She needed shelter again, and the cottonwood grove seemed her best option. As darkness descended completely, she made a crude camp beneath the largest tree. The pack now held medicine, Daniel's horse, and the scrap of coat, small comforts against the vast emptiness surrounding her. Without a fire, the night would be bitter. Just as she was resigning herself to another night of shivering cold, a flicker of light caught her attention, a tiny, distant flame, perhaps half a mile away, visible only because of the flat terrain between. A campfire. Sarah stared at it, heart racing. Settlers? Indians? Or could it possibly be? She gathered her meager belongings with trembling hands. Common sense told her to wait until morning, that traveling across unknown terrain in darkness invited disaster. But the fire called to her. Like a beacon, and more compelling than fear or caution was the possibility, however remote, that her family waited by that distant flame. She had taken only 3 steps toward it, when a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beneath. The trees. The Pawnee hunter stood directly in her path, his expression grave in the starlight. He shook his head once emphatically and pointed back toward the trees. Then he extended his hand, palm out, in the universal signal to wait. In his other hand, He held something that made Sarah's blood run cold, a man's hat, battered and water-stained, Thomas's hat, and Thomas's. Sarah's world narrowed to that single object, Thomas's hat, with its distinctive leather band her own hands had stitched last spring. Her legs threatened to buckle beneath her as conflicting emotions surged through her veins. Evidence he'd survived. The flood, yet in a stranger's possession. "Where is he?" she demanded, voice barely above a whisper. "My husband. Where did you find this?" The Pawnee's face remained inscrutable in the starlight. He gestured again toward the trees, more insistently this time, then pointed toward the distant campfire with a slashing motion across his throat. The meaning was unmistakable. Danger, death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah hesitated, torn between the desperate need to rush toward any possibility of finding her family and the clear warning from this man who, for reasons she couldn't fathom, seemed intent on keeping her alive. "Who are they?" she asked, gesturing toward the fire. In response, the hunter touched his belt, where 3 fresh scalps hung, not his trophies but a message. He mimicked their owners with gestures Sarah recognized from frontier warnings, fingers curved like claws above his head, Crow warriors, enemies to both whites and Pawnee. Cold realization washed over her. The fire wasn't salvation, but certain death. Whether Thomas and Daniel were captives there, or whether the Crow had simply found Thomas's hat, charging blindly into their camp, would end only one way. With a final glance toward the flame, Sarah retreated into the shadows of the cottonwoods. The Pawnee followed silently, leading her deeper into the grove, until they reached a hollow where the massive root system of a fallen tree created a natural windbreak. He gestured for her to sit, then crouched a few feet away, placing Thomas's hat carefully on the ground between them, neutral territory, neither taking nor giving it fully. In the dim starlight filtering through the branches, Sarah studied her unlikely companion. His features were sharp, weathered by the elements, with eyes that missed nothing. He wore buckskins adorned with porcupine quills, and a single eagle feather was fastened in his hair. Not a chief or medicine man, but not a common warrior either. The silence between them stretched, neither having words the other could understand. Finally, the Pawnee reached into a pouch and withdrew a handful of pemmican, offering half to Sarah. Hunger overcame suspicion. She accepted the dense mixture of dried meat and berries, the first substantial food she'd had in days. As they ate, the hunter took a stick and began drawing in the soft earth between them. First, a winding line, the river, then small figures, people. He showed the flood with sweeping motions, then drew 2 figures moving downstream, one large, one small. Thomas and Daniel. Sarah leaned forward intently, nodding to show she understood. The hunter continued his story. In the dirt, the 2 figures reached shore, injured but alive. They moved west, following the river. Then new figures appeared, 3 men on horseback, Crow warriors. He drew a struggle, capture. The small figure separated from the larger one, hidden, the larger figure taken away. "Daniel is hidden." Sarah gasped, hope flaring. "My son, alive and Thomas captured?" The Pawnee's expression gave nothing away as he smoothed the earth, erasing his drawings. He pointed to himself, then made a cradling motion, followed by pointing westward. Understanding dawned slowly. "You found him," she whispered. "Daniel, you found my son." A single nod confirmed her interpretation. "Is he alive? Where is he?" "Please." Sarah reached across the space between them, stopping just short of touching the hunter's arm. "Please take me to him." The Pawnee rose in one fluid motion, indicating she should stay. From beneath his buckskin shirt, he withdrew a small object and pressed it into her palm, a carved bone whistle on a leather cord. Daniel's treasured birthday gift from Thomas. Sarah's fingers closed around it convulsively. He's alive, she breathed. Not a question this time, but realization. The hunter nodded once more, then pointed to himself, touching his chest. "Kuruk," he said, the first word he'd spoken. "Kuruk," Sarah repeated. She touched her own chest. "Sarah." Something shifted in his demeanor. Not quite a smile, but a slight easing of his guardedness. He gestured for her to remain in the hollow, miming sleep, then pointed to the east, where dawn would eventually break. With that, he melted into the darkness, leaving Sarah clutching the whistle and hat, tokens of her family, proof they had survived, and evidence that this stranger held their fates in his hands. Sleep was impossible. Questions churned through her mind as she fingered the whistle. Why would a Pawnee warrior help a white woman? Why take the risk of confronting Crow, enemies, to save a white child? Nothing in the frontier stories prepared her for this alliance. By the time gray light filtered through the trees, Sarah had reached only one conclusion. Trust, like survival, sometimes came down to instinct. And every instinct told her Kuruk was her only hope of finding Daniel alive. The hunter returned as silently as he'd left, carrying a small package wrapped in leaves. Inside was freshly cooked meat. Rabbit, she guessed from the size. Sarah ate gratefully, the warm food reviving her strength. When she finished, Kuruk handed her a water skin, then gestured for her to follow. They moved swiftly through the cottonwood, Grove keeping to cover. Sarah struggled to match his pace, her city-bred legs unaccustomed to such terrain. As they emerged from the trees onto open prairie, Kuruk suddenly dropped into a crouch, signaling for silence. In the distance, 3 mounted figures moved across the horizon, the Crow warriors searching. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Were they looking for her? For Daniel? Or was Thomas with them, perhaps as a captive? Kuruk pulled her back into the cover of the trees, his expression grave. He sketched a quick map in the dirt, showing their current position, the Crow warriors' direction, and their own intended path. A wide arc that would keep them hidden while still heading west. "How far?" Sarah whispered, miming the distance with her hands. Kuruk held up 4 fingers, then pointed to the sun and made an arc across the sky. 4 days' journey. Her heart sank. Daniel was alone, waiting for 4 more days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kuruk seemed to read her distress. He added, to his dirt map, showing the Crow camp between their current position and their destination. The meaning was clear. They couldn't take a direct route without encountering enemies. Sarah nodded her understanding, squaring her shoulders. 4 days. She had already come this far. She would walk through fire if it meant reaching her son. They traveled in tense silence, keeping to ravines and dry creek beds whenever possible, avoiding open ground. By midday, they had covered several miles, skirting well clear of the area where the Crow had been spotted. During a brief rest, Sarah worked up the courage to ask about Thomas. She held up his hat, then made a questioning gesture. Kuruk's expression darkened. He took a stick and drew a crude figure of a man in the dirt, then 3 figures on horseback surrounding him. With a quick stroke, he drew a line across the figures. Neck then shook his head. Sarah stared at the drawing, her world collapsing inward. Not captured, kill, not captured, kill, not... "You saw this?" she asked, her voice hollow. "You saw them kill him?" Kuruk shook his head, then pointed to his eyes and made signs she interpreted as tracks and signs. He hadn't witnessed Thomas's death, but had found evidence of it. Perhaps a body, perhaps just a bloody scene. Grief threatened to overwhelm her, but Daniel's face rose in her mind's eye. Her son still lived. She still had purpose. With trembling hands, Sarah scooped up a handful of dirt from where Kuruk had drawn the figure and let it trickle through her fingers. The closest thing to burial rites she could offer her husband. She tucked his hat carefully into her bundle. "Take me to our son," she said, rising to her feet. They continued westward, the terrain gradually changing from open prairie to broken country, ravines, ridges, and scattered stands of pine. The going was harder, but the increased cover was welcome. As dusk approached, Kuruk led them to a sheltered depression beneath an outcropping of rock, a natural campsite invisible from more than a few yards away. For the first time, he risked a small fire, carefully shielded to minimize visible light. The warmth was a blessing to Sarah's aching body, and she stretched her hands toward the flames gratefully. As night settled over the prairie, bringing with it a bone-deep chill, Kuruk unfolded a buffalo robe and offered it to her. Sarah started to refuse, frontier politeness ingrained even now, but practicality won out. She wrapped herself in the warm hide, murmuring thanks. Across the fire, Kuruk watched her with those unreadable dark eyes. After a long moment, he began to speak softly in his own language. Though the words meant nothing to her, the cadence suggested a story, or perhaps a prayer. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. Understanding dawned. He wanted exchange, story for story, prayer for prayer, a human connection transcending their vast differences. Sarah cleared her throat. "Our Father, who art in heaven," she began, the familiar words of the Lord's Prayer falling from her lips like water from a spring. As she spoke, some of the tension eased from her shoulders. This small ritual of civilization, of her past life, anchored her in the wilderness. When she finished, Kuruk nodded solemnly. Then, to her surprise, he took a small object from his medicine pouch and held it out, a silver locket on a delicate chain. Sarah gasped, recognizing it instantly. Her own locket, containing miniature portraits of Thomas and Daniel, lost in the flood. "Where?" she began, reaching for it with trembling fingers. Kuruk mimed finding it along the riverbank. When Sarah opened it to reveal the water-damaged but still recognizable portraits, he pointed to the image of Daniel, then gestured westward, nodding. "Yes," Sarah confirmed, touching the boy's likeness. "My son. We're going to him." The hunter studied the portrait of Thomas, then looked at Sarah questioningly. With a lump in her throat, she nodded toward the ground, confirming what his earlier drawing had conveyed. Thomas was gone. Kuruk's face softened momentarily. He touched his chest, then gestured toward the stars, speaking a phrase that needed no translation, acknowledgement of her loss, of the warrior's journey to the next world. That night, wrapped in the buffalo robe with her locket clasped tightly in her hand, Sarah wept silently for Thomas. Not the racking sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of acceptance. Her husband was gone, but her son lived. Half her heart remained to be saved. Dawn broke with a sound that sent ice through Sarah's veins, horses approaching, and men's voices speaking a language she didn't recognize. Crow warriors. Kuruk was already moving, stamping out the fire's remnants and gathering their few possessions with swift efficiency. He motioned for Sarah to follow him deeper into the rocks, crawling on hands and knees through a narrow crevice that widened into a hidden pocket just large enough for them both. Through a small gap in the rocks, Sarah watched as 3 mounted warriors entered their campsite. Their appearance was as frightening as any frontier tale, faces painted with bold red and black stripes, scalps hanging from their belts, rifles and bows at the ready. One dismounted, kneeling to examine the fire pit. He spoke sharply to his companions, pointing to the ground. They had found signs of recent occupation. The warrior remounted, and the 3 began a methodical search of the area, working outward in a spiral pattern. It would be only minutes before they discovered the crevice. Beside her, Kuruk silently drew his knife. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the warriors would hear it. 3 armed men against 1 knife. The odds were impossible. As the Crow warriors drew nearer, Kuruk suddenly thrust his medicine pouch into Sarah's hands, along with Daniel's whistle. He pointed urgently toward the back of their hiding place, where Sarah now noticed the crevice continued, narrowing to a tight squeeze that might, just might, allow a person of her size to escape unseen. The meaning was clear. He meant to create a diversion while she escaped. "No," Sarah whispered, clutching his arm. "Not alone." Kuruk's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw clear emotion in them. Grim determination and something else. Purpose. From outside came a shout. They had been discovered. With one fluid motion, Kuruk pushed Sarah toward the escape route, then turned to face their pursuers, knife gleaming in the dim light. The last thing Sarah saw as she squeezed through the narrow passage was Kuruk rising, to meet the first Crow warrior who entered their hiding place, one man standing between her son and oblivion, a stranger who had become her only ally in a merciless wilderness. Blood roared in Sarah's ears as she squeezed through the narrow passage, rocks scraping her shoulders raw. Behind her, the clash of steel and war cries echoed through the stone. One man against three. Kuruk's sacrifice would mean nothing if she hesitated now. The passage twisted sharply downward, then opened suddenly onto a steep ravine. Sarah tumbled out, catching herself against the rocky slope. No time to assess injuries, no time for fear. She scrambled down the incline, loose rocks, avalanching beneath her feet. Above, the sounds of struggle ceased. The silence terrified her more than the fighting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah pressed herself into a crevice as voices carried from above, crow hunters shouting to each other. She clutched Kuruk's medicine pouch and the whistle against her chest, willing her ragged breathing to quiet. A shadow fell across the ravine as a warrior appeared at the passage opening. Had he seen her? Sarah didn't wait to find out. She bolted downslope, abandoning stealth for speed. A shout confirmed her worst fear. She'd been spotted. The ravine narrowed ahead, funnel-like, toward what appeared to be a dead end. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, mind racing faster than her feet. Kuruk had sent her this way deliberately. He wouldn't have directed her into a trap. The rock wall loomed before her. As she neared it, she noticed a dark horizontal slash at its base, a gap perhaps 18 inches high and several feet wide. Without slowing, she dropped to her knees and slid through the opening like a child diving beneath a fence. Inside was darkness and the smell of damp earth. A cave. Sarah crawled forward blindly until certain she was beyond reach from the entrance, then collapsed, gasping for breath. Behind her, angry voices gathered at the cave mouth. Shadows darkened the slim opening as warriors peered inside. One attempted to follow, shoulders too broad for the narrow gap. Frustrated shouts followed, then the unmistakable sound of a rifle being primed. Sarah pressed herself flat against the cave floor as a shot echoed through the confined space, the bullet ricocheting off stone somewhere above her. More shouting, another shot. Then silence, save for receding footsteps. They weren't leaving, merely seeking another entrance or perhaps planning to smoke her out. Sarah felt her way deeper into the darkness, one hand against the cold stone wall, the other clutching her precious bundle. The slope angled downward, the air growing colder and damper. How deep did this cave system go? Panic threatened as the darkness pressed in. What if there was no exit? What if she was entombing herself? A faint glow appeared ahead, not daylight, but a strange, ethereal blue-green luminescence emanating from the cave walls themselves. As her eyes adjusted, Sarah saw she'd entered a chamber where mineral deposits glowed with ghostly light. Just enough to navigate by. The chamber opened into a series of tunnels. Which to choose? Sarah stood frozen with indecision until a faint draft brushed her cheek from the leftmost passage. Moving air meant an opening somewhere. She followed it. The tunnel wound downward, then leveled out. The glowing minerals faded, plunging her back into darkness. Sarah's fingers traced the wall, encountering dampness, then the unmistakable trickle of water, an underground stream. Frontier wisdom taught that water always found a way out. Sarah knelt, fingers trailing in the icy current to determine its direction, then followed it downstream. How long she stumbled through darkness, she couldn't say. Time lost meaning in the lightless void. Her world narrowed to the sound of water, the feel of stone, and the steady cadence of her own heartbeat. When light finally appeared ahead, a pale, distant circle, Sarah nearly sobbed with relief. The tunnel widened as it approached the exit, allowing her to straighten from her crouched position. Cautiously, she peered out. The cave opened halfway up a cliff face, overlooking a deep canyon. Below, a river snaked through the landscape, not the Platte, but a smaller tributary. No sign of the Crow warriors from this vantage, but they could be anywhere. Sarah assessed her position. The cliff below the cave mouth was steep, but not sheer, with enough handholds and ledges to attempt a descent. Above and to either side, the rock face offered no better options. She tied Kuruk's medicine pouch and Daniel's whistle securely inside her bodice, then began the treacherous climb down. Twice she dislodged small cascades of pebbles, freezing in place until certain no one had heard. By the time her feet touched solid ground, her hands were bloody from clutching rock. The canyon bottom offered both blessing and curse. Water from the river, but little cover. Sarah filled her water skin, then studied the terrain. The canyon ran roughly east-west, always west, toward Daniel. A terrible realization struck her. Even if she escaped the Crow hunters, she no longer had Kuruk as guide. Daniel's location remained a mystery somewhere to the west, a needle in a vast wilderness haystack. Sarah opened the medicine pouch, seeking anything that might help orient her. Inside, she found items both practical and mystical. A small flint and steel for fire-making, a bundle of dried herbs, a polished stone, and a scrap of hide with markings similar to those Kuruk had drawn in the dirt. A map, crude but recognizable. The winding line of the river, distinctive rock formations marked with symbols, and at one edge, a drawing that could only be mountains. Among them, a small circle with a mark beside it that recalled the cradling gesture Kuruk had made when speaking. Of Daniel, hope kindled in her chest. She had a destination. Now, she needed only to survive long enough to reach it. Sarah traveled westward along the canyon floor, keeping close to the rock wall for cover. The sun climbed higher, its warmth a blessing after the cave's chill. She paused only long enough to gather a few edible plants recognized from her frontier woman's knowledge, wild onions and bitter but nourishing greens. By midday, the canyon began to widen, its walls growing less steep. Soon it would open onto the plains, leaving her exposed. Sarah studied Kuruk's map again. If she interpreted it correctly, she needed to follow the tributary to its junction with the main river, then continue west. A sound stopped her cold. Horses, approaching. No time to climb back up the canyon wall. Sarah pressed herself into a shallow recess beneath an overhanging rock and held her breath. 3 mounted warriors appeared around the bend. 2 she recognized from the earlier attack. The third, Sarah's heart skipped. The third rider sat slumped forward, hands bound to the saddle horn, face hidden by long dark hair. But even from this distance, she recognized the buckskin shirt, now torn and bloodied. Kuruk. Alive, though clearly injured. The Crow had taken him captive rather than killing him outright. An unusual choice that suggested they had questions, or perhaps intended a more ceremonial death for a rival warrior. Either way, his presence changed everything. Sarah's first instinct was to remain hidden, to prioritize Daniel. But as she watched the warriors pass, a cold certainty settled in. Her gut, without Kuruk she might never find her son. And the Pawnee hunter had risked everything to save her. Some debts couldn't be measured against even a mother's duty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot. To us! Now back to the story. Sarah waited until the riders disappeared around the next bend, then followed, keeping to the shadows along the canyon wall. Tracking them wasn't difficult. The soft canyon floor held clear hoofprints, and the warriors, believing themselves alone, made no effort to conceal their passage. The canyon widened steadily until it finally opened onto rolling grassland. Here, Sarah paused, weighing her options. Following the warriors across open country would expose her. Yet she couldn't abandon Kuruk, not when he'd sacrificed himself for her. As she debated, dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, a storm approaching, both problem and opportunity. In the distance, the Crow riders had stopped, apparently, making camp early in anticipation of the weather. They chose a small copse of trees near where the tributary joined the main river, the very landmark Sarah sought. Fortune or disaster? She couldn't tell which. Sarah circled wide around the open ground, using what little cover the terrain provided. The gathering storm aided her approach, wind masking small sounds and darkening skies, reducing visibility. By the time she reached the outer edge of the trees, fat raindrops had begun to fall. From her position she could see the Crow camp, a small fire, 3 horses picketed nearby, and Kuruk bound to a tree trunk. The warriors huddled near the fire, speaking in low voices. One occasionally glanced toward Kuruk with a gesture that needed no translation, a discussion of when and how their captive would die. Sarah assessed her meager advantages: surprise, the storm, the warriors' confidence in their isolation. Against these, their superior numbers, weapons, and strength. The rain intensified, driven by gusting wind. Thunder rumbled closer. The warriors pulled buffalo robes around their shoulders, faces turned toward the fire, backs to the darkness beyond their camp. One rose and approached Kuruk, knife in hand, not for killing, but to taunt. He pressed the blade against the Pawnee's, a cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. Sarah's fingers closed around a rock the size of her fist. She had one chance, and it would come at terrible risk. She waited for the next thunderclap, then hurled the rock with all her strength into the trees. On the far side of the camp, the impact sent birds scattering into the storm, their alarmed cries carrying over the rain. The warriors spun toward the sound, instantly alert. 2 headed toward the disturbance, disappearing into the foliage. The third remained by Kuruk, knife, now pressed to the captive's throat. As he scanned the darkness, Sarah crept forward through the rain, mud silencing her footsteps. In her hand she gripped a sharp stone, the only weapon she could find. 10 feet from the remaining warrior, a twig snapped beneath her foot. The Crow warrior whirled, knife raised. Sarah froze, exposed in the firelight. For one heartbeat, surprise held the warrior motionless. In that frozen moment, Kuruk suddenly drove his head backward into his captor's stomach. Though bound, the force of his movement unbalanced the warrior, sending him stumbling back a step. Sarah lunged, driving her stone weapon toward the warrior's throat. He deflected her attack with a forearm, sending pain shooting through her wrist. The knife in his other hand arced toward her, a crack split. The night, not thunder, but the distinctive report of a rifle. The warrior crumpled, a red stain blossoming across his chest. Sarah spun toward the sound. At the edge of the firelight stood a tall figure, rifle still raised, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat streaming with rainwater. "Ma'am," said a familiar voice, "you're a long way from the wagon train." Sarah stared in disbelief as the man stepped forward, features resolving in the firelight. Jeremiah Collins? The grizzled farmer who'd tried to convince her to return east after the flood lowered his rifle. "Didn't expect to find you alive, Mrs. Winters, let alone tangling with Crow warriors." Shouts from the woods indicated the other warriors had heard the shot and were returning. Collins gestured urgently. No time for reunions. Cut him loose. Sarah grabbed the fallen warrior's knife and slashed Kuruk's bonds. The Pawnee staggered as circulation returned to his limbs, but his eyes were clear, taking in Collins with one swift assessment. "My horse is just beyond those trees," Collins said, reloading his rifle. "Can your Indian friend ride?" "Yes," Sarah answered for Kuruk, who was already moving toward the picketed horses. "But the other warriors will be on us any second," Collins finished grimly. "Go. I'll hold them off." Sarah hesitated, caught between gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you here? How did you find us?" Collins's weathered face softened momentarily. "I followed the river west, same as you. Figured if anyone could have survived that flood, it'd be Thomas Winters and his boy." His eyes met hers with genuine regret. "Found Thomas 3 days back. Buried him proper." The confirmation of her husband's death hit with surprising force, even though Kuruk's drawings had prepared her. "And Daniel," she managed. "No sign, but—" Collins broke off as running footsteps approached. "Go! Now!" Kuruk appeared at her side, leading one of the crow horses. He pulled Sarah up behind him just as the first warrior burst from the trees. Collins's rifle cracked again, and the warrior fell. As they galloped away from the camp, Sarah looked back to see Collins mounting his own horse, the remaining warrior in pursuit. Then the storm swallowed all of them in sheets of driving rain. Kuruk drove the horse hard through the deluge, heading west along the river. Sarah clung to him, mind reeling from the encounters. Thomas confirmed dead, Collins appearing like a ghost, and now fleeing through a storm with Kuruk, an alliance that defied all frontier logic. When they finally stopped, it was in a rocky overhang that provided shelter from the worst of the rain. Kuruk slid from the horse, then helped Sarah down. His face was a map of cuts and bruises, but his eyes held a fierceness that spoke of unbroken spirit. In the dim light, Sarah examined the medicine pouch, relief washing through her when she found the map undamaged. She held it out to Kuruk questioningly. The Pawnee studied it, then looked up at the storm-dark sky. He touched the mountains on the hide, then pointed westward, holding up 2 fingers. 2 days' journey. So close, yet with crow warriors hunting. Them and a storm raging, it might as well be 1,000 miles. "Daniel," Sarah said, touching the marked circle on the map. "My son. Why did you save him? Why help us?" Kuruk regarded her steadily, then reached out and gently touched the locket that hung around her neck. With deliberate movements, he opened it to reveal the portraits inside. His finger traced the image of Daniel, then moved to touch his own chest over his heart. The gesture could have meant many things, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. This was personal for him somehow. From outside came the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching through the rain. Friend or foe? The storm would not shelter them much longer. Hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off stone. Sarah pressed against the rock wall, knife clutched in white-knuckled hands. Kuruk knocked an arrow, his movements fluid despite his injuries. The stolen crow horse shifted nervously, sensing their tension. Shadow appeared at the mouth of their shelter, a lone rider slumped in the saddle. "Mrs. Winters?" Jeremiah Collins wavered there, one hand pressed to his side, where blood seeped between his fingers. "Reckon I found you again." He toppled from the saddle, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Sarah rushed forward, dragging the wounded man into shelter. His coat bore a fresh bullet hole just below the ribs, the flesh beneath torn and angry. "He needs help," she said, though Kuruk was already kneeling beside them, examining the wound with practiced hands. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Did you lose them?" Sarah asked, pressing her wadded-up kerchief against the bleeding. Collins grimaced. "For now. Shot one. Other turned back. He'll bring more." Kuruk stood abruptly, moving to the shelter's entrance to scan the rain-swept landscape. His posture communicated what words couldn't. They weren't safe here. The remaining crow would return with reinforcements, and a wounded man would slow their flight considerably. The bullet went clean through, Sarah said, examining Collins's wound more carefully. If we can stop the bleeding. No time for doctoring. Collins pushed himself to a sitting position, face grey with pain. Your boy's waiting. You need to go. Now. We can't leave you here, Sarah protested. Collins gave a wheezing laugh that turned into a cough. Wouldn't be alive now if I'd listened to you at the river crossing. Seems fitting somehow. His eyes shifted to Kuruk. Your Pawnee friend knows. Ask him. Sarah looked at Kuruk, who had returned to their side. His face revealed nothing, but when he took her hand and placed it over the map in her pocket, his meaning was clear. Daniel came first. Collins understood the stark calculus of survival on the frontier. I came west looking for my own redemption, Collins said softly. Lost my wife, my daughter to fever back in Ohio. Blamed God. Blamed myself. Thought maybe a fresh start. He shook his head. Give me your gun. I'll buy you time. Before Sarah could respond, Kuruk intervened. He knelt beside Collins, speaking a few words in his own language while touching the wound. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, he began preparing a poultice from the herbs in his medicine pouch. What's he doing? Collins asked, watching with wary fascination. Helping you, Sarah replied, equally surprised. She had expected Kuruk to insist they leave immediately. The Pawnee worked quickly, applying the herbal mixture to both entry and exit wounds, then binding them with strips torn from Collins's own shirt. Throughout, his face remained inscrutable, but his hands were gentle, his movements precise. When he finished, Kuruk sketched a quick map in the dirt, their location, the mountains, and a third mark halfway between. He pointed to Collins, then to this midpoint, before looking at Sarah with a questioning expression. She understood. You're suggesting we take him part way, find somewhere safer to leave him. Kuruk nodded once. Collins tried to protest, but his strength was failing. The boy... Daniel's waited this long, Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. He can wait a few more hours. Together, they managed to get Collins back on his horse, Sarah mounting behind to keep him upright. Kuruk led them out into the diminishing rain, now heading northwest rather than due west. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and treacherous footing. They traveled slowly, forced to stop frequently when Collins's strength flagged. Each delay wound Sarah's nerves tighter. How much time did they have before Crow reinforcements picked up their trail? How long could Daniel survive alone, wherever he was? As daylight faded, they reached Kuruk's chosen refuge, a sandstone formation riddled with shallow caves. He helped Collins into one of these natural shelters, then disappeared briefly, returning with an armful of branches and grasses for bedding. You should go, Collins murmured as Sarah redressed his wound. Both of you. Boy needs his mother. And I need to know you're settled before we leave, Sarah replied firmly. I've lost enough people these past days. While she tended Collins, Kuruk built a small, nearly smokeless fire at the back of the cave, where its light wouldn't betray them. The warmth was welcome as night temperatures plummeted. Collins drifted into uneasy sleep, his breathing labored but stable. Sarah finally allowed herself to truly look at her unlikely companions. The grizzled frontier farmer who'd followed her westward out of some personal quest for redemption, and the Pawnee warrior whose motives remained a mystery. Why? She asked. Kuruk quietly, gesturing between them. Why help us? Why risk everything for strangers, enemies by the usual reckoning? Kuruk stared into the flames for a long moment. Then, with deliberate movements, he pulled aside the collar of his buckskin shirt to reveal an old scar on his shoulder. A distinctive pattern Sarah recognized instantly. A brand. the mark of a slave trader who'd operated out of St. Louis years ago. "You were captured," she whispered. "Taken east?" Kuruk nodded, then continued his story through gestures. He'd been young, perhaps Daniel's age. The brand was followed by a gesture of rocking an infant. A woman had helped him. Then walking westward, returning to his people. A white woman helped you escape, Sarah interpreted. Brought you back west, the Pawnee confirmed with a single nod. Whatever debt he felt he owed, he was repaying it now. To Daniel, to Sarah, perhaps to the memory of the woman who had shown him kindness. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, knowing the words were inadequate. At dawn, they prepared to leave Collins, with a waterskin, pistol, and what food they could spare. Kuruk had chosen well. The cave was defensible, hidden from casual observation, yet close enough to the river for water once Collins could move again. 3 days, Sarah told him. "If we're not back by then." "I'll head east," Collins finished. "Get help if I can." The unspoken reality hung between them. If they weren't back in 3 days, it likely meant none of them had survived. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kuruk led them northwest now, riding double on the crow horse, pushing the animal as hard as they dared. The terrain grew steadily more rugged as they approached the foothills of the distant mountains. By midday they were following a game trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen, the air growing cooler with the elevation. Sarah studied Kuruk's map constantly, matching landmarks with growing excitement. A distinctive split rock, a bend in the river shaped like a fishhook, a lone pinnacle thrusting up from the valley floor. They were close. Late afternoon brought them to a steep ridge overlooking a secluded valley. Kuruk reined in the exhausted horse, pointing to a thin wisp of smoke rising from among the trees below. "There?" Sarah asked, heart hammering. "Daniel's there?" Kuruk slid from the horse, offering her a hand down. His expression remained guarded, but something in his eyes had changed, a softening, perhaps even concern. "What is it?" she asked. "What? Aren't you telling me?" The Pawnee hesitated, then touched his head, mimicking injury. "Daniel's hurt." Fear lanced through her. Kuruk made a small gesture with his hand, not severely, but yes. Then he added a sleeping motion, followed by waking, and sleeping again. The boy had been unconscious, had awakened, then relapsed. "Take me to him," Sarah said, already moving toward the path leading down to the valley. "Now!" They left the horse picketed on the ridge and descended on foot, moving cautiously through the forest. Kuruk led the way with silent efficiency, pausing occasionally to check for signs of danger. The crow hadn't found this place yet, but that could change at any moment. The smoke led them to a small clearing where a crude shelter had been fashioned from branches and hides. Beside it, tending a cook fire, was a young Pawnee woman. She rose. As they approached, hand going to the knife at her waist before recognizing Kuruk, words flowed between them in their native tongue. Explanations, Sarah assumed. The woman, barely more than a girl, perhaps 16, cast curious glances at Sarah but maintained a respectful distance. Kuruk gestured for Sarah to follow him to the shelter. He paused at its entrance, meeting her eyes with a look that seemed to contain both warning and reassurance. Sarah ducked inside, momentarily blinded by the dim interior after the bright afternoon sun. As her vision adjusted, she made out a small figure lying on a bed of furs. "Daniel," she breathed. Her son lay pale and still, a bandage wrapped around his head, his breathing shallow but steady. Sarah fell to her knees beside him, hands hovering over his form as if afraid he might shatter at her touch. "Daniel," she repeated louder this time. "It's Mother. I'm here." The boy's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Sarah turned to Kuruk, who had entered behind her. "What happened?" His head, Kuruk mimed the flood, then striking a rock. He'd found Daniel unconscious on the riverbank, the side of his head bloodied. Sarah gently turned her son's face, examining the bandage. It was clean, recently changed. The Pawnee woman had been caring for him with evident skill. "But he woke once?" she asked hopefully. Kuruk nodded, holding up 2 fingers. "Twice. Both times briefly." It was a good sign, but the fact that he remained unconscious now, days after the injury, was deeply concerning. Sarah stroked her son's face, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I'm here now, Daniel. Mother's here. I found you. We're going to be all right." Outside, a sharp word from the Pawnee woman brought Kuruk to the shelter's entrance. A rapid exchange followed, the woman's tone urgent. "What is it?" Sarah asked, though she knew before Kuruk answered. The Pawnee made the sign she now recognized for crow, followed by pointing in multiple directions. They were coming. Many of them. The valley was about to become a battleground. "We have to move him," Sarah said, rising. "Now!" Kuruk shook his head. Moving Daniel in his condition could kill him, but staying meant certain death or capture for all of them. The Pawnee woman appeared in the entrance, speaking rapidly to Kuruk. He listened intently, then turned to Sarah with a question in his eyes. The woman had a suggestion, but it would require separating. Through a combination of gestures and the few words they'd established between them, Sarah understood the plan. The Pawnee woman would take Daniel deeper into the mountains, to her people's summer hunting camp. Sarah and Kuruk would create a false trail, drawing the crow away in another direction. "No," Sarah said immediately. "I won't leave him again." Kuruk took her hands, his gaze intense. He pointed to the approaching crow, then to himself and Sarah, making fighting motions. Then he pointed to Daniel, shaking his head solemnly. The message was clear. If the crow found them here, they would all die, including Daniel. The woman could move swiftly with one injured child. Sarah and Kuruk together might create a diversion convincing enough to save him. "How do I know he'll be safe?" "How do I know I'll find him again?" Sarah's voice cracked with the impossible choice before her. Kuruk spoke to the woman, who hesitated, then removed a beaded necklace from around her throat. She placed it in Sarah's hand, closing her fingers around it. "What does this mean?" The Pawnee woman touched the necklace, then her own heart, and finally pointed to Kuruk. "She's his sister," Sarah realized aloud. "Or his wife." The woman's eyes flashed with something like amusement. She shook her head, pointing again to Kuruk, then to herself, making a cradling gesture. "Daughter?" Sarah guessed. "No, that's not right. You're too close in age," Kuruk interrupted with a single word. "Tanapa." The woman nodded. "Tanapa," Sarah repeated. "A name, not a relationship." Kuruk touched his chest. "Kuruk." Then he gestured between himself and Tanapa, making a horizontal motion with his flat hand, then raising 2 fingers side by side. "Brother and sister," Sarah understood. "Tanapa is your sister." The relief of this realization was immediate. Not a random Pawnee woman, but Kuruk's own blood. If he trusted his sister with Daniel, how could Sarah not? A distant cry, a hunting call, drifted into the clearing. The crow were coordinating their approach. "Go!" Sarah said to Tanapa, the word insufficient for the faith she was placing in this woman. She pressed a kiss to Daniel's forehead, whispering, "Mother will find you, I promise." Tanapa gathered the still unconscious boy into her arms with surprising strength. Before leaving, she locked eyes with Sarah, a silent vow passing between them, woman to woman, transcending the barriers of language and culture. Then she was gone, disappearing into the forest with precious cargo. Kuruk moved with renewed urgency, gathering what few supplies they could carry. Their strategy was simple but dangerous. They would take the horse, leave obvious tracks heading southwest, away from the mountains where Tanapa carried Daniel. "Will it work?" Sarah asked as they mounted. Kuruk's answer was a slight shrug that conveyed both hope and realism. It might work, it might not. But it was Daniel's best chance. They rode out of the valley as the sun dipped toward the horizon, intentionally breaking branches and leaving clear signs of passage. Behind them, the first Crow scouts had already discovered the abandoned camp. The chase had begun. Sarah clung to Kuruk as the horse galloped across open ground, fully exposed now. She didn't look back. Looking back meant doubt, and doubt meant death. She'd survived the flood, found evidence of her family, discovered Thomas's fate, tracked Daniel across wilderness. Now she rode with a Pawnee warrior, leading Crow hunters away from her injured son, her only hope resting with a native woman she'd just met. Somewhere in the madness of it all, Sarah found herself smiling grimly at the absurdity. If she lived through this, no one back east would ever believe her story. If she lived. The horse stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, recovering quickly but losing stride. They'd pushed it too hard. It wouldn't maintain this pace much longer. Ahead, the land dipped toward a ravine, offering temporary cover. Kuruk guided the laboring horse toward it. They never made it. The first arrow struck the horse's flank. The animal screamed, rearing in pain and terror. The second arrow narrowly missed Sarah's shoulder. Kuruk yanked her from the saddle as the horse collapsed beneath them. They tumbled into the high grass, the Pawnee's body shielding hers from the impact. "Run!" he gasped in her ear, the first direct English word he'd spoken to her. But it was too late. Rising from the grass around them, like spectres, were 5 Crow warriors, arrows nocked and aimed at their hearts, The Crow warriors' faces bore the painted streaks of a death party. No captives today, no negotiations. Sarah felt Kuruk tense beside her, calculating odds that couldn't be beaten. "Take him," she whispered, stepping forward with raised hands. "I'm the one who killed your man at the cave." Kuruk grabbed her arm, but Sarah shook him off. "My son needs his uncle," she said loudly, emphasizing the false relationship. "Let him go." The warrior's eyes darted between them, momentarily confused by this unexpected development. The leader, distinguished by an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers, barked an order. 2 braves seized Kuruk, while another shoved Sarah to her knees. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The leader dismounted, studying Sarah with cold curiosity. He spoke, words incomprehensible but tone unmistakable. Questions. "I don't understand you," Sarah said, straightening despite the brave's restraining hand on her shoulder. "But I know what you want. Revenge. Take it from me, not him." The Crow leader chuckled, a sound devoid of mirth. He drew his knife, its blade catching the fading sunlight. Sarah refused to flinch as he pressed the cold metal against her cheek, just firmly enough to dimple the skin without breaking it. Behind her, Kuruk struggled against his captors, shouting something in his native tongue. The Crow leader's eyes flicked to him, narrowing with recognition. These men knew each other. The knife left Sarah's face as the leader strode toward Kuruk. Words flew between them, charged with ancient hatred. The leader spat at Kuruk's feet, then turned back to Sarah. With newfound interest, he spoke again, making a sweeping gesture toward the mountains, then a cradling motion, asking about Daniel. Sarah's blood froze. Had they seen Tanapa escaping with her son? She kept her expression blank. "I don't know what you're saying." The leader's backhanded blow caught her unprepared. She tasted blood as she sprawled in the dirt. "Tsawopive," Kuruk said suddenly, the unfamiliar word cutting through the tension like a blade. The Crow warriors stiffened. Their leader turned slowly, eyes widening with what Sarah could only describe as superstitious dread. "Tsawopive," Kuruk repeated, straightening to his full height despite his captors. He nodded toward Sarah. "Tsawopive." Whatever the word meant, It hit the Crow warriors like a physical force. They exchanged uneasy glances. The leader stared at Sarah with newfound wariness, then fired rapid questions at Kuruk. Kuruk's response was measured, dignified. He gestured toward the mountains, then the sky, then traced a symbol in the air that made the warriors step back. The leader considered for a long moment, eyes never leaving Sarah. Then, astonishingly, he resheathed his knife. A curt order sent. One of the braves scurrying to retrieve something from a saddlebag. The brave returned with a leather bundle, which the leader unwrapped to reveal a familiar object. Thomas's revolver. Sarah's breath caught. The weapon her husband had carried since their journey began, taken from his body after his death. The leader checked that it was loaded, then, inexplicably, offered it to Sarah. She hesitated, certain it was a trick, a test. The leader's face revealed nothing as he waited, arm extended. "Take it," Kuruk said quietly in English. Sarah's fingers closed around the familiar grip of Thomas's gun. Instead of turning it against her captors, which would have meant instant death, she raised it skyward and fired a single shot. The report echoed across the open ground, startling birds from distant trees. The Crow leader nodded once, apparently satisfied. He spoke again to Kuruk, who translated haltingly. He says, "You are Tsawapive, spirit-touched, Deathwalker." Kuruk's normally impassive face showed a flicker of something like awe. "You crossed water that kills, found child taken by river spirits, followed dying man's pointing hand." The Crow braves had released Kuruk now, backing away to a respectful distance. The leader continued speaking. He says, "Woman who walks with death is bad medicine. Powerful spirit, kill her. Her ghost hunts forever." Understanding dawned. The Crow believed her a supernatural being, a woman who had survived what should have killed her, who followed a ghost's direction, who allied with traditional enemies to save a child from river spirits. "Tell him he's right," Sarah said, seizing the unexpected advantage. "Tell him I've walked with death and returned. Tell him I command spirits of flood and fire." As Kuruk translated, she raised Thomas's revolver again, this time pointing it at a dead branch hanging from a nearby tree. Her shot shattered it, sending fragments raining down. The display was theatrical, even foolish, wasting precious bullets on showmanship, but the effect on the Crow warriors was immediate. They backed their horses away, hands making warding gestures. The leader alone maintained his composure, though his eyes had narrowed to suspicious slits. He addressed Kuruk again. "He asks what spirit woman wants," Kuruk translated. "Why you walk his hunting grounds?" "Tell him I follow my son's spirit," Sarah replied, improvising. "Tell him the river spirit stole him, but I tracked him to the mountains. Tell him I mean no harm to the Crow people, but anything that stands between a spirit mother and her child will be destroyed." The leader listened to Kuruk's translation with an impassive face, then mounted his horse. He spoke a final time, the words carrying the weight of formal declaration. He says, "Crow warriors do not fight spirits." Kuruk translated, "You may pass to the mountains, but never return to these hunting grounds. If you are seen here after 3 days, they will know you are just a woman, and they will take your scalp." With that, the leader wheeled his horse around. The warriors followed, disappearing into the gathering dusk as suddenly as they had appeared. Sarah's legs gave way beneath her. She sank to the ground, Thomas's revolver still clutched in her trembling hand. "What just happened?" she whispered. Kuruk knelt beside her. "They fear you now. Fear is stronger than hate. And this word, Tsawapive, what does it truly mean?" Kuruk's expression was unreadable. "It means one who has died but walks again, one who exists between worlds." He hesitated. "My people have stories of such beings. They bring both blessing and curse." Sarah looked down at Thomas's revolver, this unexpected gift from enemies who now believed her something other than human. "Will they follow us?" Not tonight, Kuruk replied, but their fear will turn to anger when they realize the truth. We must reach the mountains before then. Their horse lay dead, their supplies scattered. Night approached rapidly, and they had miles to cover before reaching the relative safety of the foothills, where Tanapa had taken Daniel. We walk, Kuruk said simply, gathering what he could salvage from their belongings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They traveled through the night, guided by stars and Kuruk's unerring sense of direction. The ordeal with the crow had cost them precious hours, pushing them north before they could double back toward the mountains. By dawn, Sarah's feet were blistered raw inside her deteriorating boots, but she refused to slow their pace. "How much farther?" she asked, as they paused by a stream to drink and refill their water skin. Kuruk pointed to a distinctive peak, now clearly visible against the morning sky. "There! Tanapa knows this place. We'll wait." The mountain loomed both promisingly close and discouragingly distant, perhaps a day's journey on foot through increasingly rugged terrain. Sarah pressed her palm against Thomas's revolver, now tucked securely in her belt. Its weight was both comfort and burden, a tangible connection to her lost husband and a reminder of the bizarre manner of their escape. "The crow," she said hesitantly. "You knew their leader?" Kuruk's face hardened. "Black Hawk. He killed my father." The simple statement hung in the air between them, layered with unspoken history, Yet you risked yourself for us, for my son, for me." Sarah studied the enigmatic man who had become her unlikely guardian. "Why?" Kuruk was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured, as if each one required precise translation from thought to speech. "When I was boy, white men took me. Slave chains, dark ship, bad place." His hand unconsciously touched the brand on his shoulder. "White woman helped me escape, brought me home. She said, 'Life owes you nothing. You owe life everything.'" He looked directly at Sarah, eyes reflecting the rising sun. "I saw your son by river, small, broken, like me once. I remembered woman's words, such simple explanation for such extraordinary compassion." Sarah found herself without adequate response, humbled by the moral clarity that transcended the supposed boundaries between their worlds. They continued their journey as the sun climbed higher, the terrain growing steeper, more challenging. By midday, they were navigating a series of rocky ridges, each one higher than the last. "We're being followed," Kuruk said suddenly, pausing to study their back trail. Sarah turned, shading her eyes against the glare. At first, she saw nothing but the empty landscape they'd traversed. Then movement, a distant figure on horseback, moving steadily in their direction. "Crow?" she asked, hand going to Thomas's revolver. Kuruk shook his head. "One rider. Crow hunt in groups." They watched the approaching figure for several tense minutes. As it drew closer, details became clearer. A white man on a buckskin horse. "Collins?" Sarah whispered in disbelief. Indeed, the grizzled farmer who should have been recovering in a cave miles away steadily closed the distance between them. When he was close enough to be recognized without doubt, he raised a hand in greeting. "Thought. I told you not to wait for me, Mrs. Winters," he called as he reached the base of their ridge. Sarah scrambled down to meet him, Kuruk following more cautiously. "Your wound," she began, noting the bloodstains on Collins's shirt. He waved away her concern. "Your Pawnee friend's medicine worked better than any doctor's. Fever broke last night. Figured you might need help more than I needed rest." His eyes flicked to Kuruk, then back to Sarah. "Found your trail, saw Crow sign too." "We had an unusual encounter," Sarah said, unsure how to explain their supernatural escape. Collins grimaced. "Heard the shot. thought the worst. He patted the rifle, slung across his saddle. Came anyway. This rough, practical man had followed them despite his injury, despite the danger, expecting only to recover bodies or die avenging them. The frontier bred its own kind of loyalty, its own form of honor. My boy, Sarah said, he's in the mountains, injured. A Pawnee woman, Kuruk's sister, has him. Has. Collins nodded, unsurprised by the unlikely alliance. You'll want to hurry then. Take the horse, I can follow on foot. No, Sarah shook her head. You're still wounded, and we need to move fast. She glanced at Kuruk, who had been silently assessing Collins. Can 3 ride that horse? Kuruk studied the animal, then gestured for Collins to dismount. He examined the horse's legs, its breathing, the condition of its tack. Finally, he nodded. Not fast, but yes. They arranged themselves awkwardly, Kuruk at the reins, Sarah behind him, Collins at the rear, his face grey with the effort of remounting, but determined. The horse protested briefly at the unusual burden, then resigned itself to the slow, careful ascent. The mountain grew steadily closer as afternoon stretched toward evening. They followed game trails where possible, Kuruk occasionally dismounting to scout better paths. Collins, despite his stoicism, was clearly struggling, his wound reopening with the jostling ride. There, Kuruk said finally, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from a sheltered valley between 2 ridges. Sarah's heart leapt at the sight. Daniel? Kuruk nodded. Tanapa's fire. They urged the tired horse forward, descending into the valley as the last daylight faded from the sky. The smoke led them to a small clearing where a single figure tended a well-concealed fire. Tanapa rose as they approached, her face revealing both relief at her brother's return and wariness at the sight of Collins. She spoke rapidly to Kuruk, who responded with reassurances. Daniel, Sarah said, sliding from the horse before it had fully stopped. Where is he? Tanapa gestured toward a small shelter fashioned from branches and a buffalo robe. Sarah rushed toward it, heart in her throat, uncertain what she would find. Inside, illuminated by the fire's glow filtering through the branches, Daniel lay as she had last seen him, still pale, the bandage around his head stark against his fair skin. But as she knelt beside him, his eyelids fluttered. Daniel, she whispered, taking his small hand in hers, it's Mother. I'm here. The boy's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding her face. Mother? His voice was weak, confused. I had a strange dream. There was water everywhere, and then an angel with feathers in her hair. Sarah laughed through sudden tears, stroking his face. That was no angel, my brave boy. That was Tanapa. She's been caring for you. Daniel's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of this. Father, he said suddenly. Where's Father? The river. Sarah swallowed hard, unsure how to tell her 10-year-old son that his father was gone. But Daniel deserved truth, not comforting lies. Father saved you from the flood, she said gently. He got you to shore, but he was very brave, and sometimes brave people. He went to heaven, Daniel whispered, a tear tracking down his pale cheek. I remember now. He told me to be strong, to wait for you. He said you'd find me because you always keep your promises. Sarah gathered her son into her arms, this miracle child who had survived flood and injury against impossible odds. Outside, she was vaguely aware of Collins and the 2 Pawnee siblings talking in low voices, making plans. But all that mattered in this moment was the steady beating of Daniel's heart against her own. They had found each other. Against flood and wilderness, injury and enemies, they had found each other. But their journey was far from over. Daniel was still weak, the mountains harsh, winter approaching, and somewhere behind them, a Crow war party would soon realize they had been deceived by a woman they thought touched by spirits. A woman who, in truth, had walked through death's shadow and emerged stronger than she ever thought possible. Dawn painted the mountain peaks crimson as their unlikely band prepared to move. Daniel, secured in a carrying sling fashioned from Tanapa's shawl, rested against his mother's chest. The boy drifted between wakefulness and sleep, his recovery. Fragile but progressing. "How far to your people's camp?" Sarah asked Tanapa, who was packing her few belongings with efficient grace. Kuruk translated the question, then his sister's answer. 2 days north. Hidden valley, safe from Crow, many warriors. Collins, leaning heavily against the horse, studied the towering mountains ahead. "We won't outrun them if they're tracking us, not with wounded and a child. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The farmer's condition had worsened overnight, his wound seeping dark blood despite Tanapa's ministrations. His face bore the waxy pallor of a man running on determination, alone. "You need a doctor," Sarah said quietly. Collins managed a grim smile. "Nearest white doctor's 300 miles east. Might as well wish for wings." Kuruk and Tanapa conferred briefly in their language, gestures suggesting disagreement. Finally, Kuruk approached Sarah with a proposition via halting translation and gestures. "Split up," he said. "I lead Crow away south. You, Collins, Daniel, go with Tanapa to our camp." Sarah immediately shook her head. "No more separating. We stay together." "Crow believe you, spirit woman," Kuruk persisted. "Follow me, they think follow you." His logic was sound, yet the prospect of dividing their already vulnerable party struck Sarah as dangerous folly. Before she could argue further, Daniel stirred against her. "The Feather Lady says we should listen to her brother," the boy murmured, eyes still closed. Sarah glanced sharply at Tanapa, who was watching them intently. "You understand English?" Tanapa's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sparkled with something like amusement. When she finally spoke, her accent was thick, but her words unmistakable, small words, not speak good, listen good. The revelation that Tanapa had understood their conversations all along momentarily stunned Sarah. Collins chuckled, despite his pain. "Never knew a native who admitted understanding English right away," he said. "Gives them advantage." Tanapa approached, placing a hand on Daniel's forehead with maternal gentleness. "Boy fever again. Need medicine. Our camp have." She gestured to Collins. "Him too. Die soon without help." The brutal assessment hung in the crisp mountain air. Sarah felt Daniel's skin, indeed warmer than it should be. The head wound was fighting back. "How can I trust you'll keep them safe?" she asked Tanapa. The Pawnee woman drew herself up proudly. "Kuruk save your son. I save your son. Now you not trust." Shame colored Sarah's cheeks. This woman had risked everything to protect Daniel, while Sarah created a diversion. Distrust now was poor repayment. "Kuruk!" Sarah turned to the warrior who had become so central to their survival. "You're certain this is the best way?" He nodded once, confidence evident in every line of his body. "Crow, follow me south. When safe, I circle back. Find you at camp." Collins pushed himself upright, wincing. "Listen to him, Mrs. Winters. Your boy needs care. We can't give him out here. And truth told, I won't last another day without proper tending." The decision crystallized with cold clarity. Daniel's survival outweighed all other considerations. "How will you find us again?" she asked Kuruk. In answer, he removed a beaded band from his wrist and tied it around Sarah's. "This marks you family. Any Pawnee will bring you to camp." Before dawn fully broke, they parted ways, Kuruk riding Collins' horse south, leaving clear tracks while the rest of their party headed north on foot, Tanapa leading. Sarah carried Daniel in the makeshift sling, the boy's feverish weight a burden she would have carried across continents if necessary. Collins walked beside her, one hand pressed to his wound, the other gripping a sturdy branch as a walking stick. Tanapa set, a demanding pace despite their limitations, following game trails invisible to Sarah's untrained eye. They moved through forests of lodgepole pine and across alpine meadows, vibrant with late wildflowers. The beauty around them stood in stark contrast to their increasingly desperate condition. By midday, Collins could go no further. He collapsed, beside a trickling stream, breath coming in ragged gasps. "Leave me," he managed between pained breaths. "Get the boy to safety." Sarah exchanged glances with Tanapa, who knelt to examine Collins's wound. The Pawnee woman's expression darkened as she peeled back the blood-soaked bandage. "Bad spirit in blood," she said, using English out of apparent respect for the dying man. "Need medicine soon?" "Can we carry him?" Sarah asked, though the answer was obvious. Collins was a large man, and they had no travois or horse. Tanapa shook her head. "I go. Bring help. You stay." Alone. Alarm shot through Sarah. What if the crow find us? Tanapa pointed to a rocky overhang 20 yards upstream. "Hide there, no fire, no sound." She withdrew a bone knife from her belt and pressed it into Sarah's hand. "I return before dark." The Pawnee woman departed swiftly, moving with the fluid grace of one born to the mountains. Sarah helped Collins to the sheltered overhang, settling him as comfortably as possible against the rock. "Didn't expect to end this way," Collins muttered, his normally ruddy face ashen. "Always figured to die in my own fields." "You're not dying today," Sarah said firmly, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Collins managed a weak smile. "No shame in truth, Mrs. Winters. We've all borrowed more time than we were owed these past days." Daniel, momentarily lucid, reached out to touch Collins's hand. "Mother says God decides when it's our time, not us." A rough chuckle escaped Collins. "Your mother's a wise woman, boy. Wiser than most men I've known." His eyes, fever-bright, found Sarah's. "When you get back to civilization, tell them what happened here. How strangers became allies. How enemies showed mercy. Folks need to hear such things." "You'll tell them." "Yourself?" Sarah insisted, though Collins's meaning was clear. He was entrusting her with his legacy. As afternoon waned, Collins slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and irregular. Daniel's fever also intensified, the boy alternating between confused murmuring and uneasy sleep. Sarah sat between them, one hand on each, a human bridge between two fading lives. The sun touched the western peaks, its light bleeding from the valley. Tanapa had promised to return before dark, yet no sound broke the mountain stillness save wind in the pines and the soft gurgle of the stream. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Shadows lengthened across the valley. Floor. Sarah found herself counting heartbeats. Collins's faltering, Daniel's rapid, her own steady despite mounting fear. She had survived flood and wilderness, had faced down Crow warriors, yet this silent waiting strained her courage beyond all previous tests. A twig snapped in the forest below. Sarah froze, knife clutched in white-knuckled fingers. The sound came. Again closer, deliberate steps, not bothering with stealth. "Tanapa," she called softly, hoping yet dreading the response. Silence answered her. Then a voice, male, unfamiliar, speaking English with a heavy accent. "The woman who walks with spirits should not fear." A figure emerged from the trees, an elderly Pawnee man leaning on a staff carved with symbols. Behind him came 4 warriors carrying a hide stretcher, and finally Tanapa. Relief flooded through Sarah as the Pawnee approached. The old man, clearly a medicine man or chief by his bearing and the deference shown him, knelt beside Collins, placing gnarled fingers on the farmer's throat. He spoke to Tanapa, who translated, My father says his spirit walks between worlds already. We must hurry. Your father? Sarah asked, surprised. Tanapa nodded. Father of our people, shaman. The warriors transferred Collins to the stretcher with gentle efficiency. The shaman then turned his attention to Daniel, examining the head wound with knowing hands. He spoke again, and Tanapa's translation carried carefully measured hope. The boy's spirit is stronger. Fever is the body fighting, not surrendering. We have medicine that will help. Within minutes, they were moving through deepening twilight, guided by the warriors who seemed to navigate the darkening forest by instinct. The shaman walked beside the stretcher carrying Collins, occasionally stopping to press herbs into the wound or murmur what sounded like prayers. Your brother, Sarah said to Tanapa as they walked side by side, Daniel cradled between them. Will he be safe? Tanapa's expression softened. Kuruk is clever like fox, brave like bear. He returns when journey is finished. The simple confidence in her voice reassured Sarah more than elaborate promises might have. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest and check on their patients. By dawn, they reached the edge of a hidden valley, nestled between towering peaks. Below, a Pawnee summer camp spread along a clear stream, perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a semicircle, morning cook fires sending thin columns of smoke into the crystal air. The crystal air. The crystal air. As they descended into the valley, children spotted their approach and ran to meet them, voices raised in curious excitement. Women emerged from lodges, men paused in their tasks. The arrival of outsiders, particularly a white woman and child, clearly constituted an exceptional event. The shaman spoke, his authoritative voice instantly silencing the murmurs. Whatever he said caused the gathered Pawnee to regard Sarah with expressions ranging from awe to wariness. What did he tell them? She asked Tanapa. That you are Sawopiv, that you walk in both worlds, that you are under his protection. The same mysterious designation Kuruk had used to save them from the crow. Sarah wondered at its power, this label that transcended tribal enmities and earned respect where fear or hatred might otherwise reign. Collins and Daniel were carried to the shaman's lodge, a large structure distinguished by painted symbols and animal hides. Inside, space had been prepared. Clean furs laid out, medicines arranged in ceremonial patterns, a fire burning with sweet-smelling herbs. For the next 2 days, Sarah rarely left the lodge, watching as the shaman and 2 female healers worked. To save Collins and reduce Daniel's fever, the farmer hovered at death's edge, occasionally surfacing to consciousness only to slip away again. Daniel improved more steadily, his periods of lucidity lengthening, the fever gradually subsiding. The 3rd morning, Sarah emerged from the lodge to find the camp in sudden commotion. Warriors were mounting horses, women hastily gathering children into lodges. What's happening? She asked Tanapa, who was hurrying toward her. Scouts saw riders approaching, many riders. Fear clutched at Sarah's heart. Crow? Tanapa shook her head. Not crow, different. She hesitated, then added, white men. White men. Sarah's mind raced. Soldiers, settlers, trappers. None should be in these mountains this late in the season, and none would be friendly to a Pawnee camp. The shaman emerged from his lodge, speaking rapidly to the gathered warriors. Tanapa translated in terse phrases. My father says we should not fight unless attacked. He asks if you will speak to them, woman who walks between worlds. Tell them we have harmed no one. The request startled Sarah. They may not listen to a woman, the shaman replied directly, Tanapa translating, they will listen to a ghost. Sarah understood then. To white men, she would appear as one risen from the dead, a survivor of a disaster presumed to have killed all. Her word might carry weight precisely because of its unexpectedness. She nodded agreement, and preparations were swift. The shaman painted a single white line across her forehead. The mark of one who had crossed between life and death. Tanapa braided her hair in the Pawnee style, intertwining small beads that caught the light. Sarah climbed to a rocky promontory overlooking the valley's entrance, accompanied by 6 warriors who remained slightly behind her. Present, but not threatening. From this vantage, she could see the approaching riders, still distant but moving steadily closer. As they neared, details became visible. Perhaps 20 men, most in buckskins rather than uniforms. Trappers, then, or mountain men, potentially more dangerous than soldiers who at least answered to distant authority. The lead rider spotted her and raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. He urged his horse forward alone, approaching to within speaking distance. A tall man with a graying beard and the weathered face of one who lived beneath open skies. "Ma'am," he called, removing his hat in a gesture of unexpected civility. "Jim Bridger at your service. Might I ask what white woman stands with Pawnee warriors in these mountains?" "Sarah Winters," she replied, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Survivor of the Platte River crossing disaster." Bridger's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That train was lost 3 weeks back. Word reached Fort Laramie that all souls drowned." "Not all," Sarah said, conscious of the dramatic figure she must present. Woman believed dead, marked with a white line, standing among Pawnee warriors high in the Forbidden Mountains. Bridger studied her with frank curiosity. "And the Pawnee, they're holding you captive? They saved my son's life, and a wounded companion. They've shown nothing but kindness." The mountain man's expression registered disbelief. "Ma'am, with respect, these ain't the friendly natives from your Eastern storybooks." Sarah took a step forward, letting him see the steel in her eyes. "Mr. Bridger, I've buried my husband, tracked my son across wilderness, faced down Crow war parties, and walked paths that would make your trappers blanch. I'm fully aware of frontier realities." She gestured toward the camp below. "These people could have killed us many times over. Instead, they've healed us, fed us, protected us." Bridger rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Mighty unusual tale. It's been a mighty unusual journey. Now, what brings armed men to this valley? Tracking a Crow war party that's been raiding settlements. Trail led us here." He hesitated. "There's a reward for survivors of that wagon train. Relatives back east posted it. I'd be honored to escort you and your boy to Fort Laramie, once he's fit to travel." The offer represented everything Sarah had sought since the disaster. Safety, return to civilization, a future for Daniel. Yet she found herself hesitating. There's a wounded man in the camp who needs care before he can be moved. And she paused, thinking of Kuruk, still out there somewhere, possibly leading Crow warriors away from them at great personal risk. "And I'm waiting for someone who helped us get this far." Understanding dawned in Bridger's eyes. "The Pawnee brave who's been drawing the Crow south. We found signs of him. Clever fox, that one. Had those Crow chasing shadows for days. Is he—" Sarah couldn't finish the question. Bridger smiled. "Last we saw, he'd doubled back toward these mountains. Should be here by nightfall if he keeps." That pace, relief washed through her. Kuruk alive, Collins stabilized, Daniel recovering, and now a path back to civilization opening before them. From the depths of disaster, an impossible journey was nearing its end. That evening, Bridger and his men camped respectfully outside the valley, honoring Sarah's request for distance. The unexpected courtesy suggested the mountain man's reputation, for wisdom was well earned. As promised, Kuruk returned with the setting sun, riding into camp to a hero's welcome. His surprise at finding Bridger's men nearly led to conflict until Sarah explained the situation. "The circle closes," Kuruk said simply when he understood. "Your journey ends where it must, among your own people." "Because of you," Sarah replied. "Because you found a dying boy by a flooded river and chose compassion over indifference." Kuruk shook his head. "Because you are Tsa Wopive, one who walks between worlds." That night, the shaman performed a ceremony to mark Daniel's recovery and honor those who had helped him. Collins, still weak but finally turning toward life rather than death, was carried to the ceremonial fire. Bridger attended as representative of the white men's world. When the dancing and prayers concluded, the shaman approached Sarah, speaking through Tanapa. "My father says your spirit has earned a name among our people," Tanapa translated. "He calls you woman who finds her way through darkness. This name will be remembered in our stories." The shaman pressed a small carved amulet into Sarah's palm, a river symbol intertwined with a protective sign. "For the journey ahead," Tanapa explained, "it carries the strength you have earned." Sarah accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, understanding its significance transcended the small object itself. Bridger approached as the ceremony concluded. "We'll head out in 3 days, if your friend can travel by then." He nodded toward Collins, who was being helped back to the healing lodge. "Fort Laramie first, then east, if that's your choosing." "East," Sarah echoed, the words suddenly hollow. After everything, east no longer meant home. Home had been washed away in the flood, buried with Thomas, transformed by the journey. Daniel, sitting nearby wrapped in a borrowed buffalo robe, looked up at his mother. "Do we have to go back, Mother, to where we came from?" The question crystallized the nebulous thoughts that had been forming in Sarah's mind throughout their ordeal. "No," she said with sudden conviction, "not back, forward." Bridger's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am?" "We started this journey seeking a new life in Oregon Territory," Sarah explained. "Thomas believed in that future. I see no reason to abandon it now." "Winter's coming fast to the mountains," Bridger cautioned. "Pass will be snowed within weeks." "Then we'll winter at Fort Laramie and continue in spring," Sarah replied. "My husband died pointing westward. I won't dishonor that by turning back." The mountain man studied her with newfound respect. "You're a rare woman, Mrs. Winters." "No," Sarah shook her head. "I'm simply a woman who discovered her own strength when necessity demanded it." In the days that followed, Collins regained enough strength to sit up and take broth. The shaman's medicines, combined with the man's stubborn constitution, had accomplished what seemed impossible. He would live, though the journey ahead would tax his endurance. On their final evening in the Pawnee camp, Sarah sought out Kuruk. She found him by the stream, carving a small wooden horse similar to the one he'd first shown her as proof of Daniel's survival. "We leave tomorrow," she said, settling beside him on a sun-warmed rock. Kuruk nodded, continuing his careful work. "Good journey, westward. Bridger knows the way." "I came to thank you," Sarah said. "Words seem inadequate, but they're all I have." The Pawnee warrior looked up from his carving, his normally stoic expression softening. "No thanks needed. I followed the path set before me." "As did I," Sarah replied. "Though I never imagined where it would lead." Kuruk handed her the finished carving, a perfect match to Daniel's lost toy. "For your son to remember." "He'll never forget," Sarah assured him. "Nor will I." She hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered since their first meeting. "Will I see you again?" Kuruk's gaze turned westward, toward mountains touched with early snow. "Seasons turn, paths cross, perhaps." It wasn't a promise, but in this uncertain world, promises held little weight against the vagaries of fate. What mattered were choices made in crucial moments, the hand extended, the life saved, the mercy shown. Dawn broke clear and cold on their departure day. Bridger's men fashioned a travois for Collins, who protested the coddling but lacked strength to walk. Daniel, remarkably recovered though still thin and pale, rode double with Bridger himself. the mountain man entertaining the boy with carefully edited tales of wilderness adventures. The Pawnee gathered to witness their leaving. The shaman blessed their journey. Tanapa embraced Sarah with unexpected emotion, and Kuruk stood slightly apart, proud and resolute, a guardian seeing his charges safely to their next destination. As they rode from the valley, Sarah looked back. One final time, Kuruk raised his hand in farewell, the gesture containing everything words could not express. She returned the salute, then faced forward toward the waiting wilderness, toward Oregon, toward whatever future awaited a woman who had walked through darkness and emerged transformed. 6 months later, Sarah Winters stood on a bluff overlooking the Columbia River, watching Daniel splash along its shallows with children from the small settlement they now called home. The winter at Fort Laramie had passed in relative comfort, Collins recovering fully enough to court and marry a widow from a later wagon train. When spring arrived, Sarah and Daniel had joined a new group of settlers bound for Oregon Territory, Sarah serving as guide through territories she'd come to know intimately. Her reputation preceded her, the woman who had survived the Platte disaster, who had trekked wilderness with a Pawnee warrior, who had faced down Crow war parties. Woman who finds her way through darkness, though few knew that name. A movement on the far riverbank caught her attention, a lone figure on horseback, watching the settlement from a respectful distance. Even at this range, she recognized the straight-backed posture, the distinctive way of sitting a horse. Daniel saw him too. "Mother, look!" The boy waved enthusiastically, receiving a raised hand in return. Sarah smiled as Kuruk turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the forest as silently as he had appeared. He hadn't approached the settlement, wouldn't risk the complications. His presence might cause among nervous settlers, but he had come to see that they were safe, that the journey he had helped make possible had reached its intended end. She touched the Pawnee amulet she still wore beneath her dress, feeling its contours against her skin, the river symbol intertwined with protection, a perfect emblem for her journey from desperate survivor to woman of strength and purpose. Behind her, the settlement bustled with activity, cabins being raised, fields being plowed, a community taking shape in this new land. Daniel's laughter carried across the water, the sound of a child who had faced darkness and emerged still capable of joy. Sarah Winters took a deep breath of clean western air, filling her lungs with possibility. The journey had transformed her, as surely as water shapes stone. Not by force, but by persistence, by finding paths of least resistance, by never ceasing to move forward. She had been the last survivor of a river-crossing disaster, tracked for 7 days by a Pawnee hunter who became her salvation. Now she was simply herself, a woman who had discovered that courage isn't about fearlessness, but about moving forward despite fear. That strength isn't about never falling, but about rising again. That survival sometimes depends on trusting those you've been taught to fear. As she turned back toward the settlement, toward her new life, Sarah whispered words meant for absent. Ears for Thomas, for Kuruk, for all who had shaped her impossible journey. I found my way through darkness, and now I walk in light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.